several people said, this is so un-Norwegian to, challenge the professors that, that we don't do that. We have many private thoughts, but we generally try to keep them to ourselves. And it isn't like we aren't very bright and very, question authority. That's not the problem. We just don't do it publicly. So, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Winnie. I'm working at the outpatient clinic here in Oslo, and I'm mainly interested in attachment theory and developmental psychology. And you stated that disorganized attachment predicts borderline personality disorder, which I would like to challenge you, because
yes, good.
That's disputable, isn't it?
Yes.
I would like to hear elaborate your statement, please.
Well, it's disputable. What the statement is based on, there's two things. One is that Carl and Lyons Ruth's work, which indicates that children with disorganized attachments go on into these controlling patterns of relationship with their parents by the time they're 6 to 8, which very much mirror the interpersonal patterns you see in adults, and that they predict self-harm behavior and excessive anger and behavioral discontrol in adolescence. So those might all be seen as prodromes, or things which are early signs of the development of borderline personality disorder. Unfortunately, she doesn't have a large enough sample to say with any authority that that goes on to borderline personality disorder. But it seems highly likely, and hence the statement. Thank you very much. Yeah. That was great. See, I try to slip things by, and I don't have any shame about it. So, anything else? So, what we're going to cover during this next half hour is disclosing the diagnosis. And the basic message about this is don't hesitate to do it. Many of the reasons why clinicians are hesitant to give the diagnosis has to do with our perceptions that this is a bad diagnosis to have. And some of this goes back to the myths about the disorder, that it's untreatable or intractable. So we don't want to discourage our patients by giving them such a negative message. Other sources, behind this are our perception that the diagnosis is equivalent to calling somebody mean or demanding or entitled or manipulative. So we don't want to call the patients that, and so we hesitate to give the diagnosis. And those are basically countertransference issues, things that we project onto the diagnosis as opposed to what the diagnosis means in its larger sense, which has to do with something that can be hopeful and which can be treated. The perception of willful treatment resistance. These are phrases which have been in the literature: help rejecting complainers, emotional hypochondriacs. The idea of this being intractable came, when this diagnosis was first established and being written about, most clinicians' experience was like mine. That is, I got interested in defining this syndrome largely because these were the patients which were driving everybody nuts, and we didn't have a name for them. They kept coming back over and over again. I had no idea then that what I was seeing was these cross-sectional exposures, that a lot of people, you'd see them once and they go away and they wouldn't come back. But that was not what borderline personality disorder meant. Borderline personality disorder meant the person who kept coming back to the emergency room and was such a nuisance. So that became the prototype for the disorder, as opposed to what we now know. Unrealistic expectations of competence. It's very easy because borderline patients, when they feel held and cared for, can perform so well and be such wonderfully interesting, bright people, to assume that that's what they can be all the time. And their vulnerabilities and their limitations are not evident, and then you hold them that expectation that this is the way they can and should be all the time. It's not a bad idea to have for them and you that with maturation, with more learning, with experience, they can learn to adapt in a way which is closer to their better selves than what you see when they first enter treatment. But it is unrealistic to think that they can do that overnight and it's simply a matter of willpower. Character flaws, irresponsible, fickle, egocentric. Okay, and then this last one, which is, I think, important, is that the borderline patients themselves are afflicted with really negative ideas about themselves. That it's easy to adopt, and these are some quotes from borderline patients. And when people think this way about themselves, you have to be proactive in sort of thinking that this isn't all there is, and that this isn't reality. This is a negative concept which takes its place beside people who think too highly of themselves, a subject for treatment, something that is a symptom of their disorder. She's a psychopathic, delusional, borderline personality because I'm a psychopath. I know it. So, they perpetrate actively sometimes this idea about themselves which is very negative and which encourages people to think badly of them and avoid them. And then there's the misinformation that I've already talked about heritability and prognosis. Just a brief, this is information now that's highly condensed. There's a vast literature about it. But it's what you all should know. That is, every clinician who treats borderline patients, and that means every clinician, should know about the basic outline of the prognosis for this disorder and about the basic facts about its etiology. About its prognosis is that most patients get better, and when they get better, they stay better. Only about 12% relapse after they get better. That's a very distinctive course. It's quite different. Now, going back to this previous slide, it does not mean that they get better quickly. They get better gradually. Some people get better quickly. The original, one of the first papers that I authored from the Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Study, CLIPS, was I was taken aback when we found that there are some people with borderline personality disorder who had remissions at 6 months, that they'd fallen below 2 criteria, and that they stayed below 2 criteria when we did the follow-up at 12 months. And I said, well, they must have been false positives. They probably were not borderline, have borderline personality disorder, though the requirement to get into the study is that you had to be over 5 criteria for the previous 2 years. And it's true that of the 18, roughly 10% of our sample that fell below criteria at 6 months, I think it was 2 or 3 were false positives. Their scores had been elevated because of severe substance abuse or bipolar disorder. But the majority of them had been accurately diagnosed, and their history of prolonged, sustained criteria was verified. What happened is that they underwent situational changes. Situational changes which were oftentimes facilitated by brief interventions by clinicians who would never have known the effects of what happened. Borderline patient was on an inpatient unit where, with a lot of support and encouragement, she disclosed her lesbian identity to her parents, who she felt had become estranged from and feared their alienation and criticism. And it turned out that they could accept this about her and welcomed her back into the family. It was a major change in her life. And it had a lot to do with her shame about some part of her identity. Other patients got out of abusive relationships or found more supportive partnerships. And just as that original slide showed about how context-dependent the borderline psychopathology is, if they feel held and cared for, the symptoms disappear. If they feel estranged and alone, then all gets exacerbated. You, as clinicians, sometimes can do short-term interventions which have enduring effects, at least in terms of the symptom remissions. We never knew this until we did longitudinal research. But the larger portrait is borderline patients gradually get better. And by a year, 25% will have remissions, which they'll sustain. By 2 years, 45% will have remissions that they sustain. And it goes up to around 85% by the time they're 8, 9 years along. And more recent study by my colleague Mary Zanarini, at 16 years, she says that it's about 65% of borderline patients have recovered, meaning that they have sustained positive relationships and sustained and satisfactory vocations. So that's a very different portrait of what borderline patients should expect and the message that you want to give borderline patients. When you know this, and you feel, when you know this, the idea of giving the borderline patient this diagnosis is radically changed from when you thought it was an intractable or untreatable disorder. It carries with it a lot of reassuring messages. And the bad news is that the borderline, even though people with this disorder recover symptomatically, the vast majority of them, many of them still remain functionally impaired. So that the symptom remissions, whether that comes from treatment or not, these previous samples were not people who received treatment, DBT, MBT, TFP, or anything else. Most of them, in our study, the CLIP study, were selected out of 19 different outpatient clinics representative of all socioeconomic groups and cultural diversity. They got better without any BPD treatment. But though they get better symptomatically, they oftentimes remain unhappy in terms of their work and the close relationships they crave. If the borderline patient remits in symptoms, the chances of their functioning are improved. That is, doing time lag analyses over time. If they get better functioning, that will predict that their symptoms will remit too. It's not quite as strong in that direction, but if you help a person get a job, for example, that's going to likely be followed by less symptoms. Just as if you have less symptoms, that's more apt to facilitate your getting a job. They have a reciprocal relationship. The predictors are nothing surprising, unfortunately, but the better your work function and education function have been in the past, the better your prognosis for remission and recovery are. The earlier the age in which you start treatment, the better the prognosis is. So this is simply a review of the criteria. I will assume that if you're at this meeting, it's because you're interested in the disorder and there are no surprises there. As an aside, when the DSM-5 was being developed, and while the ICD-11 is being developed, I think, there's a lot of controversy about what to do with borderline personality disorder. And one of the problems people said is that the disorder is too heterogeneous and has too much overlap with other disorders. That probably isn't true. That is, any more so, for example, is less heterogeneous than depression. And that the argument is made with 9 criteria. You can have like 168 different ways to make the diagnosis. The diagnosis largely, the criteria differ in their frequency. So if you have self-harm, if you have abandonment fears, and you have anger, that's about 85% of the variance right there. And those are very common things, and that accounts, so it's not like all criteria are equal. By dividing it into these sectors, it provides a more condensed and I think a more solid way of making the diagnosis, that you need to have the diagnosis by having criteria in 3 of the 4 different sectors. Most notably, the interpersonal and the emotional sides are the most discriminating and most important. Now, this video just shows ways to disclose the diagnosis. And the patient is very winsome, but probably not typical. Okay?
So we've been talking for the last while about your depression, about your boyfriend, about the problems you brought you here. And I want to talk a little bit about what we think you may have and what we might do about it. Have you ever heard of borderline personality disorder?
No, I've heard of bipolar disorder. I don't know what that is.
Okay. It's not bipolar disorder, although there can be some things in common. But let's talk about it. Maybe the easiest would actually be to just go through the criteria together and see if we think this might be in the ballpark. I mean, you can tell me.
She's a girl of Scandinavian descent who lives in Minnesota.
Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment.
Okay.
Kind of what we were talking about with the boyfriend and
Yeah.
this fear of him leaving.
Yeah, I can see that.
A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships with, they're either all good or all bad, idealized or devalued.
They're all bad.
They were all good at one point.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, okay. Those two we've talked about a lot. The one I'm not as sure of, identity disturbance, an unstable sense of yourself that changes a lot over time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if it's what I think it is, like, I don't know, I don't feel like I fit in anywhere.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that.
Okay. Impulsivity in a couple areas that could be self-damaging, like spending, driving your car too fast, recklessly, substance abuse.
Is that why I have all those tickets?
Could be.
Well, I'm on probation.
Yeah.
Yeah, my license was suspended.
And we talked some earlier about the eating being
Yeah. So I can blame it all on borderline?
in part, that actually, if you could understand the borderline part of what fuels the speeding tickets or the binging and purging of what's happening inside, actually it could help explain it and could help the other things get better too, is why I'm kind of going for this one first.
Okay.
The next one is recurrent suicidal behavior or self-injury. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like we did being in here locked up a few times. So.
Yeah. Affective instability due to a reactivity of mood, so intense episodes of depression or that only lasting a few hours or a few days, not like weeks of a depressed mood, but just like something happens
That's
and your
totally
mood
me out.
plummets.
I'm so moody. Like, everyone tells me, you're so moody. You're always like either just totally up or totally down, and it just changes. They can't predict it.
Okay. Chronic feelings of emptiness. Do you feel empty inside?
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about it, but yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel just kind of numb.
Uh-huh.
Well, actually, a lot of times. Yeah.
Inappropriate or intense anger, difficulty controlling your anger.
Oh man, the other people piss me off. Maybe that was a display of anger. I don't know. I guess people say they don't want to mess with me because I get angry so quickly.
And then the last one is, and I don't know if you get this, under stress, some people can get a little paranoid, feel like people are really out to get them.
Totally. Yeah, I get that way. Like my last job, that I got fired from because I got pissed off at someone. I thought they were talking behind my back, and people were like, "No, that's not happening." But yeah, I mean that fits me to a level that's kind of creepy.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh. The other way I will sometimes talk with people about it is that kids with borderline, I think, are born with a higher level of emotional sensitivity, and they just feel their feelings more intensely than most people, and they're more likely to react to their feelings, and they're probably come that way. And then they may be a little more likely to attribute anger or rejection to people that take care of them. And they grow up feeling like it's unfair, like life is unfair, and they can't get their needs met. And then as they enter adulthood, they want to find an exclusive relationship with somebody that can help those needs feel met. But because that relationship is so intense and so important, any perceived chink in the armor of that relationship makes somebody feel angry or bad about themselves. One of those two. And if angry leads to doing things that upsets the other person and can destabilize the relationship, if bad can lead to suicide attempts, self-destruction, which can sometimes get other people's support, which then kind of reinforces the unrealistic idea that there's supposed to be this saving good thing, and it just keeps repeating.
Kind of like what I've just gone through.
Kind of like what you just gone through. Yeah.
Yeah, you described it to the T.
Sounds like Santa Claus. So this video illustrates, how it helps to build an alliance, and the use of a developmental narrative is one that's got some advantages over just going through the criteria. Going through the criteria, though, is a very nice way to get the patient as a collaborator in making the diagnosis themselves, and that not always quite as dramatic as this instance. Patients will generally feel recognized by this and say, gee, there are other people like me, and it helps them feel less alien, and it sets the stage for their being interested and compliant with the treatment recommendations that follow. These are some comments made by patients about the borderline diagnosis. Getting the diagnosis explained so much, I couldn't make sense. I'm not just crazy. That is, borderline patients oftentimes feel that there's something profoundly wrong and different about them. There is something profoundly wrong about them, but that he find it very reassuring to know that there's a body of knowledge, that there's a lot of other people who have the same disorder, and that they can recover from it. It's a very reassuring message for a group of people who otherwise feel so alone in the world and so hopeless. Some of the benefits of disclosing the diagnosis is just that. It diminishes a sense of uniqueness. You set the stage for getting realistic expectations about what can change and what will cause change. It fosters an alliance. This is a recognized disorder with a body of knowledge. It reassures them about your competence. It decreases parent blaming, increases parent collaboration, and it prepares clinicians. That is, once you have this diagnosis in mind and know what it means that, you should be braced for the fact this is going to be a highly sensitive patient to what you say and do, and that you're going to want, more often than not, to talk about this so that because it's easy to make mistakes. It also sets the stage for a discussion of etiology. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but this, like talking to borderline patients and their families about the expected course, is something that you all should know and all should be prepared to convey to patients and their families. And here, I nod of my hat to Sven Turgeson, who in 2001 published the first twin study, which really transformed our understanding of this from an environmentally determined disorder into one which has a genetic disposition. That does not mean that it's a genetic disorder. It means that there's a disposition for this disorder which is necessary to understand the etiology. Children are born with a disposition. It also doesn't mean that it's always 55%. It could be 70% in some child and 40% in another. That's just a mean number. The more environmental adversity, the less genetic disposition it takes. The more genetic disposition you have, the less environmental adversity it takes to develop the disorder. We don't know what it is that's inherited. It's certainly not going to come down to a matter of a few genes. But the two major candidates are that it has to do with either this interpersonal hypersensitivity, or it has to do with, and this has gotten more attention because of DBT, the problems with emotional regulation. We don't know. It relates to the diagnosis itself in the sense that almost from the time this borderline personality disorder entered the official classification system, people have said borderline is an adjective in search of a noun. It's got all these pejorative meanings. Why not just change the name? Well, we ought to change the name. We ought to change the name as soon as we have a better one for it. That's a good time to take a break, don't you think?